It was a cold winter morning of January 28, 1885. Fierce winds, blizzard, and freezing temperatures discouraged anyone from wandering outside at Cape Elizabeth, Maine. Head lightkeeper Marcus Hanna was cocooned in a blanket in the safety of the light station known as Two Lights. Sick with a severe cold, he was sleeping after a difficult night shift. The man was unaware of a tragedy that was unfolding not far from his home. The schooner Australia departed from Booth Bay, Maine at 5 p.m. on January 27th. The ship was heading for Boston, and there were 3 people on board, the captain and 2 crew members. At first, the journey was uneventful, but not long after the schooner had left the port, the weather started to worsen. By midnight, a severe storm was pounding southern Maine. In no time, the temperatures dropped below zero. Ice encased the ship's mast. The snow was blinding the crew. The men had to get rid of their cargo because the schooner was listing too dangerously. To avoid the worst outcome, the captain decided to seek shelter in Portland Harbor. But luck wasn't on the seaman's side that night. With a deafening crack, the battered mainsail gave way under the weight of the ice gathered on it. The crew had nothing to do but wait until the storm calmed down. Several miles away from the schooner, Marcus Hanna was finishing his watch in the fog signal building. Even though both the beacons were shining bright, they looked faint and almost invisible in the raging blizzard. But the worst thing about the storm? Its roar prevented Hanna from hearing the Australia running aground and grinding against the cliff. Neither did he hear the shouts for help from the stranded seamen. Just before dawn, the lightkeeper's assistant, Hiram Staples, replaced him. Hanna wrapped a scarf around his face and started for the house. It was about 20 degrees outside, but the howling icy wind made it feel way colder. Several times the man had to crawl on his knees and hands to fight powerful wind blasts. When he reached home, his wife had to pry the scarf away from his face. The wool had gotten frozen to Hanna's beard. After her husband drank some hot coffee and settled in bed, Mrs. Louise Hanna went to put out the lamps in each of the towers. Suddenly, she spotted a dark shade on the rocky shore, a ship that had run aground. The woman hurried back to the house and woke up her husband. Marcus Hanna didn't hesitate. With no thought about his health or the illness that had made him weaker, the man rushed to the rescue. He slipped on his boots, a warm coat, and a hat and hurried to the fog signal building through massive snowdrifts. He had to alert his assistant. The vessel was stuck several hundred feet away from the station. Hanna and Staples saw 2 men clinging to the icy rigging. They were stiff from all the ice covering them and too cold to shout out for help. The captain, unable to hold on, had been swept away in the dark several hours before. Hanna decided to throw a lifeline to the ship, but they had to work fast. The tide was rising. Each wave covered the schooner with more and more ice. This additional weight was threatening to bring the ship down at any moment. Meanwhile, Mrs. Hanna was alarming other families at the station. The only person who could be of any help in that dire situation was Staples' 15-year-old son. Hanna sent him off to gather the neighbors. And while Hiram Staples was trudging to the nearby life-saving station, Marcus Hanna was carefully moving along the slippery rocks covered in ice. He was battling severe wind blows and freezing ocean splashes. One slip, and he would be swallowed by the waves. He got as close to the ship as he could, all the while shouting encouragement to the terrified crewmen. The schooner was too far away from the shore to reach her without getting soaked through. Hanna went into the surf up to his thighs and braced himself against some cliffs. Then he started to throw the weighted rope at the schooner, but all in vain. The lifeline either missed its mark or slid away before one of the seamen could grab it. Countless failed attempts started to wear the man down, and Hanna knew he wouldn't last much longer. He decided to have a short break and stumbled out of the surf to lie down and regain some strength. In a couple of minutes, though, the exhausted man realized he was falling asleep. It was a sure way to freeze and never wake up again. Hanna sprang to his feet and started to jump wildly to warm himself up. After flailing his arms and stamping his feet, the man felt more alert. But when he turned back to the sea, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The schooner was breaking apart under the force of the rising tide. It made Hannah summon the remaining strength and renew his attempts. His efforts paid off. The very first try was a success. The rope landed near Irving Pierce, one of the crewmen, and got stuck there. But Pierce was unable to move his frozen hands even to save his own life. Then Hannah, along with the second crew member, William Keller, started to encourage Pierce. Several minutes later, the man suddenly broke out of his icy cover, grabbed the rope, and tied it around his waist. After he got a signal from Hannah, the half-frozen Pierce dropped into the sea. The lightkeeper knew he didn't have time to wait for anyone to assist him. He mustered what little strength he still had and started to pull the seaman toward the shore. Pierce was bobbing up and down on the waves like a buoy. Hannah was afraid the man wouldn't make it, but he kept pulling. Finally, the seaman was lying on the rocks. He appeared almost gone. Hannah collapsed next to him. A moment later, he pulled himself up, untied the rope from Pierce, and threw himself into the turbulent surf once again. Keller was still waiting for the lightkeeper's help. He could move and even answered Hannah's call. It had taken more than a dozen attempts before the rope landed within William's reach. He prepared himself for the inevitable and leaped into the boiling waves. Unfortunately, Hannah had already spent all his energy. In the middle of the process, he started to hallucinate. But when it seemed nothing could save Keller, the lightkeeper felt another pair of hands taking over and pulling the icy rope. It was Staples. He returned just in time, bringing two other neighbors. Hannah and the two survivors were taken to the steam room of the fog signal building. The storm was still raging, and it was too dangerous to move the exhausted seamen to the house. They were severely frostbitten. To warm them up, their frozen clothes had to be literally cut off. Several days later, the men were taken to the hospital in Portland. Miraculously, they made a complete recovery. Staples helped Mrs. Hannah to carry her husband to their house. She was afraid that night would take its toll on the man's health. But astonishingly, Marcus was up in a mere 2 days. He even helped Staples get the rescued seamen to Portland by sled. For his devotion to duty and heroism, Marcus Hannah got the highest award in the lighthouse service, the Gold Life-Saving Medal. 10 years later, Hannah, as a soldier, also received the Medal of Honor. This made him the only person in history to receive both these awards.